Hi, this is Paul. As some of you know who watched the Friday Ashori live stream, there were technical issues between StreamYard and the places it was sending video to. StreamYard also has a feature that allows local recording, so I do have local recordings. I didn't have the skill enough to sort of patch this thing together quickly, but I do have these individual recordings of the people, so if I have time and motivation, I might try and reconstruct the Friday live stream. We'll see. We'll see. I don't know. The files are big. It would take me so much time to do it. I don't know that it's worth it to me. The recording that's out there is out there, and the recording isn't as bad as the freezing of the people. But I wanted to talk more about Don's pitch, which won, and because I thought it was an excellent pitch, and because it gets into this whole, let's say, the continual slow motion collapse of the modernist epistemic assumptions. And so I'm just gonna play Don's pitch again because I found it really thought provoking.
Just immersed in stories and the idea of story and the overarching story. And of course, that's been a continuing theme for many years. Um, Anybody in the Pajot Circle, King's North, McGilchrist, um, Zach Borkery, all these people who are talking about the story and how we embed ourselves in a story. And for Christians, of course, there's the greatest story and the overarching story. And there are many who are talking about the disintegration of the overarching story for Western civilization generally. And more specifically, Paul Kingsnorth's book came out about the machine against the machine, where he's talking about the disintegration of our story and what is replacing it, the lack of story. And then, of course, just released is Martin Shaw's The Liturgies of the Wild, which is a beautiful book, which he says is a companion or a response to Kingsnorth's sort of observation of the disintegration of our story. And he's talking about the importance of myth and story, and the greatest story in his case, because he's Christian, and how we can delve back into those stories, the great stories of all the ages, and the greatest story of Christianity, in particular for him. And if not immerse ourselves in that and withstand the tsunami of disintegration that's happening, or maybe it will help us in many different levels recover a story, recover the story, or recover our story, because he makes it very personal. So even in your own life. So because of my own story, my own journey, I should say, from a very a home church, very Protestant, very restorationist, very sola scriptura, very Puritan based, iconoclastic, the most extreme you can get on that end of the spectrum, and then ending up maybe 6 years after I started really thinking about it in orthodoxy, which is the other extreme. What appealed to me, I think, in orthodoxy, from compared to my old church, which had many beautiful things like its simplicity and its sincerity and the clarity of the fruit of the Spirit that you could see at work in people's lives. But even there were so many questions I had about the story that were not filled satisfactorily. So many words that I used, like angels, demons, the whole invisible world, which of course is what we know from Pajot and the symbolic world and all those people. So much of the story that was unsatisfying or incomplete or challenging to my very simplistic faith. So what really appealed to me and still does about orthodoxy is the vastness of the story. The idea that God is not simply maybe the angry father or the righteous father, I should say, but actually creator of the whole cosmos, of everything in it, invisible and visible. And it's such a big story. My Protestant brain is still working out some parts of that story. But what I had to do when I got 98% of the way after 15 years of a long journey of trying to work it through, is this true, rationalize, complete I should say, completely immersed and product of the culture we brought in, super rational, and Vervaeke's completely propositional rather than participatory. I felt like I needed to step into participation to get me that last 2% into real faith and into real belief and into complete immersion into a story rather than racking my brain to try and figure out what was true, what was right, what was real. And then, of course, there's Pajot's discussion about, well, what is real? What is true? And that whole invisible world. So here's my pitch. Considering the stories we inhabit, what is truth and why does it matter? So, how does truth manifest itself in the stories we believe, right? And that's a whole discussion about what is truth, right? Pajot and all that. Particularly the overarching story in which our meaning and our purposes are embedded. So, in other words, what?
Now it's important here because, of course, truth and meaning, depending on how I say meaning and when I say meaning and the context I say meaning. I mean, if we're reading a text together and someone say, what's the meaning of that word? Or they might say, what's the meaning of that word in Greek? And if you're listening to having a conversation with someone and they say, well, what do you mean? And then when we talk about a meaning crisis, we're sort of in sort of the modernist epistemic framework, we've just moved over from, well, the meaning of the word is this thing, this connector. And now the meaning is, well, it's like about an emotion. And so, she's asking hard questions about truth and meaning. We'll let her finish and then we'll move on.
Is the threshold for truth, whatever we decide that means, that is required of that overarching story that allows it to support a deep and sustaining community? And Paul, I'm hoping that that word community appeals to you too, because last time I was on, we talked about what makes a good, bad community, but then we had to talk about what is the good. How do you judge anything that's good community otherwise, unless you have an idea of the good and the good life towards which they are aimed?
Okay. And I really liked how she connected truth to community, because one of the points that I've made right from the beginning is that people are the kinds of creatures that believe together. It's really hard on human beings to not believe what everyone else believes, because we're very conscious of status. And when you believe differently from everyone else, you lose status, because what we tend to do is think, well, we gain status by what we believe. Now, and I also really liked this because part of what happens in the Protestant Reformation is there in many ways is sort of a shedding of a lot. What do I mean by that? The church had icons, had relics, had teachings, had theology. The church by the 16th century just had so much there. And part of what happens in the Reformation is they want to pare it down, and they want to pare it down to the Bible. And part of this was provoked, if you go back to some of the videos I made in the early years about Luther and Erasmus, part of this was because Erasmus was, with the advent of the printing press, not dissimilar to what has been happening with the internet. Erasmus was he could take copies of the Greek and he could compare them to the Vulgate, which was Jerome's translation of the New Testament and of the Old Testament into Latin. And very quickly you could see that if you knew a little bit of Greek, that these aren't matching up. The Vulgate is filling out things that isn't in the Greek. Now, this even gets more sophisticated, of course, because we have so many more manuscripts available to us and better manuscripts than Erasmus had. But this begins to provoke the question of, well, should we just believe on the basis of what the church says? Or should we believe on the basis of what the text says? Because the text just says this, and then the church sort of goes this. Now, let's be fair to both Protestants and Catholics here. That and Orthodox, we'll include them too. Catholics or Protestants never just sort of believe what's in the Bible, because in a way you can't. And what's behind Dawn here is an acknowledgement that, well, you still have to believe all these other things. And you don't just believe this thing that's in the Bible. There's an alignment thing that happens for people. Now, I had a really lovely conversation with Sam the other day, and it's on the channel. And we talked a little bit about his video, and we talked about this idea that he has of desire and truth, which I really liked. I made a little short out of it, but we'll play a little more. Well, good for you. Why do you think it gives you pleasure to correct the world?
I think it's just inherently pleasurable. I think that, truth, beauty, glory, it's all sort of connected. Truth especially is to do with the property of alignment. So like, in construction, right angles, square, that's called true. When you sort of, lines have a mathematical property where there is always a shortest distance between 2 points. And because there is one shortest distance, you get this aspect of singularity. Instead of like divergence, you get singularity. So like there's one point where my fingertip is like between our eye levels, right? And so wanting truth is following these lines of these alignments, trying to line things up. Somebody tells you there's cake in the fridge, you form an expectation, and then does that expectation get matched or not when you look in the fridge, right? And that's sort of your sensation of truth phenomenologically.
Why YouTube as your mode of, and I really liked that, using the word alignment, because alignment is perspectival, okay? And I think that's a much deeper way of understanding our connection with truth. Now, he has a YouTube channel, and so I started watching this, and it's not a very long video. It's longer than his other videos, but let's take a look.
As humans, we see a trail of alignments winding through the wilderness, and these alignments are what we understand to be truth. We experience alignment directly. Either fingers line up, or they don't. And if Mum says there's cake in the fridge, does that predict what I find when I go and look, or doesn't it? So we build up these networks of alignments from our experiences to do with what words mean, what things are, and so on. Constructing these trails, a network, building up our worldview. It is not so simple, however, to find out how these networks fit together, because sometimes people contradict each other. And so then we start trying on different beliefs, different models of truth, to try and explain why sometimes things contradict, and sometimes they fit together. So for a few possibilities that people have believed, well, maybe the gods define reality. So when you find a contradiction, it means the gods are fighting. Or maybe reality is an illusion, and so contradictions are actually meaningless. Or maybe there is one universal true network, and anybody who disagrees is just wrong. Or maybe you just keep on solving contradictions one after the other, and it's the truth once nobody disagrees anymore. Or maybe it really is modular, and the real mystery is when separate people and groups agree on anything at all. But yeah, I can't prove that there are no ultimate contradictions. I just haven't found any and have to take it on faith that they don't exist. Regardless, however, alignment is still the basic building block of truthiness, regardless of what broader structure you're trying to apply to it. And so, when we tell people that they should tell the truth, what we mean is that we should say the things that align with what they believe. You know, we use words like crooked or twisted for dishonesty. And in construction, true means exactly vertical or exactly horizontal, and in maths, the equals sign is to exactly aligned lines, parallel lines. So we could say that the relationship between two things is either a true aligned relationship or a false twisted one. We also want everything in our world to line up, and so we constantly try to make connections between different things. And the construction metaphor flows perfectly here, because the more well-aligned connections you make, the sturdier your worldview becomes, and you become able to construct larger theories and models and predict the future more accurately. For example, if you know a lot of true things about plants, then you can predict accurately how well they will grow in the future. Now, when two networks share a lot of common ground, truth and power become very closely correlated, where the stronger networks seem to be true. So scientists and lawyers can have productive debates where the stronger argument comes to be seen as true by both parties. Or if a therapist knows their client very well, they can point out something which the client just has no choice but to acknowledge as true. But if the common ground is not sufficient...
Now this is, who was it that was talking about coercive truth? Oh, that was Peter Williams in his conversation with Tom Holland. Coercive truth. And the coercive truth is, it's so funny because this is what people are always sort of trying to wield with their arguments. I just finished the rough draft for Sunday about the man born blind, and the man born blind is insanely reasonable with those who are interrogating him, but those who are interrogating him cannot think about Jesus in the way that people want to think about Jesus, but are afraid to, because it's going to completely destroy their world. And it's like the old saying, never trust a man who basically their income is based on their holding a certain arrangement. So you should never believe a preacher. They're liars, as Jordan Peterson called lying preachers. But I really like how Sam sort of lays this in and talks about power when you sort of have two systems that come together. And this is what we're always sort of doing with synthesis. We're taking these relations over here, taking these relations over there. And I think in many ways that's what sort of energizes the corner, in that it's so much more fun to sort of play together and to compare notes together. And of course, Nathan, you're going to have to forgive me, but I was watching you in fact, I'm going to say something really nice about you in a little while, but I was watching you in the comment section, sort of battling with Risto, and I came up, it was very Trump-like of me, but I came up with a name for Nathan, which was Captain Assertion, because that's, just sort of keeping an eye, because I always have to keep an eye on the comment section to, make sure that nothing too bad happens. And of course, Nathan's getting into it with lots of people. But I mean, Nathan's basic thing is asserting. And it's a powerful trick. And, Scott Adams would be all over this thing. It's a powerful trick. And it's exactly the same trick that Donald Trump uses, which is the tremendous irony in this case, which is that if you declare something to be true or not true, and you say it with enough conviction, and you say it often enough, people find that persuasive. Well, why? Well, it's because of this whole alignment thing, that they're just having alignment. And one of the most powerful ways that people look for alignment is alignment among people with respect to their propositions. If you have, and I think this is part of the reason confessional churches have been so powerful. And it's even there in Battlestar Galactica. So say we all, and I always add the yuck, yuck, yuck. So say we all, so say we all. That's tremendously powerful when you have assertions. and they're held by many people together. And it's more powerful when they're high status people, because then people just sort of start to fall in line. And that sort of destroys the noble idea that we're all just sort of figuring these things out on our own. And, you know, what I really like about Sam is Sam does not hold a high, he does not have a professorship at some prestigious university. He's just a rando on the internet. This is part of the reason why I really like randos, is because I think randos are fun. Because part of what happens, and you see this with the man born blind in John chapter 9, is that the religious authorities in Jerusalem cannot give up their orthodoxy. And you know, people have noted with me, you know, they want to get into things about certain, T-Grog would always get frustrated because he'd say, well, don't, because I've read your church's positions, and don't you believe such and such? I recently had a conversation with another Christian Reformed minister, and he did not, we were recording it, and then it got to the point, and he said, well, at this point, I don't want to record it anymore, because he had to say something which didn't violate subscription for him or anything like that, but he was going to say something that he knew would be unpopular if any members of his church would listen to it. And it wasn't a bad thing that he was thinking. It was a fairly common thing that he was thinking, and it was a thing that I thought, yeah, I can understand where and he's a young pastor and he's not long in his church. And I thought, I could see why you might not want to say that, but I don't think it's a horrible thing that you're saying. And again, it's not something that would violate his subscription in the Christian Reformed Church. But he was thinking through some things, and he wanted a partner to think them through with. And you know, I've been known to talk to randos, and I have a special heart for CRC people that want to come on. And so I, you know, had my conversation with him. But let's get back to Sam's excellent video.
The debates can run in endless circles, and the therapist's advice can be rejected. If you have foundational assumptions that are not addressed, the alignments cannot channel their power into your network, and so any argument will end up being unconvincing. So a hunger for alignment, or hunger for truth, is a type of desire for power, but not one we tend to judge badly as a society, because acting on it doesn't actually deprive anybody else. You know, having more people agree with you or knowing more facts doesn't reduce how many other people can have. But still, no matter how many true facts and true friends you have, you can miss the point if you don't get where somebody's coming from. So one other thing to keep clear here is when I'm talking about networks of alignment, I'm not necessarily talking about individual humans. Anything like a network is being defined by a particular perspective. So if you're sharing a methodology or a tool, you'll see things in the same way and be within the same perspective as your partners. In particular, there are two different perspectives that often get upscaled, the whole theories of truth. But I don't actually think they disagree. Not really. One is choosing an ultimate frame of reference, and then you define truth as whatever corresponds to that, with the advantage of the truth never changing, with the disadvantage being that you can't easily access it because you're not all-knowing. Or you can use a localized definition where truth is whatever is the most coherent possibility within your local frame of reference, looking at all the facts you know. The advantage being that you can have and use the truth because it's right there, but with the disadvantage being that the truth might change when you learn something new. I don't really say that they
And this is sort of a nice contrast here, coherence versus correspondence, because again, basically this correspondence, someone in the chat today said we need a word opposite the monarchical vision, which is something that very early on in the channel I sort of put out into the world, and Julian picked up on it right now. And the reason I said monarchical vision is because it's a monarchy, that's where it comes from, and you see down and you see the world as it is. And again, part of the breakdown of the modernist epistemic system is the continued disbelief. It's really sort of the resistance to mere assertion. And now assertion always, The funny thing about assertion is that it sort of purports to, it wears the clothing of the monarchical vision, but all of us know the emperors have no clothes, and that there are actually other systems among us that are determining whether such assertions are embraced formally or even implicitly. And those systems are usually hierarchical, and those systems are usually social. People, the social predictors of belief are quite accepted, but then we always sort of imagine they're not true of me. I see the world clearly. So in other words, you might say, well, someone born in a Muslim country is likely growing up with Muslim assumptions and presuppositions and filters. Yeah, but I see the world clearly. Oh, where I grew up has nothing on me. Oh, that's why you're using the same system that everyone around you uses? No. We are always the individual exception. Each one of us uniquely. So I like the correspondence versus coherence, because coherence is a little bit fuzzier. These tend to cohere. They group together.
Agree, or I'd say the only real disagreement is about which definition merits the grandness of the word truth. But again, it can be confusing if people don't specify where they're coming from. I think that the reason psychologically that people often take one path or the other here is that there are exactly two ways to calculate how good something is. A, are the bad things minimized, or B, are the good things maximized? Thinking about coherence is focusing on removing the contradictions in the entire network, and thinking about correspondence is looking for a source of maximum certainty and authority so that everything else can follow along behind. Unfortunately, I won't be able to cover it here, but I think that this particular duality is responsible for all sorts of things in the real world, such as masculinity and femininity, committee governance and single leaders, and sort of boasting culture versus cancel culture. But anyway, again, how do normal people treat truth? People often talk about personal truth, and I don't really have a problem with this, although it's a little bit complicated, because I think they're actually using the wall, the separation that they're putting up, as a heuristic, as a rule of thumb, and not as a metaphysic, as a fundamental definition of how the world works. And I think this because everybody I've ever met acts as if reality is completely internally consistent at its most basic level. Nobody's ever actually arguing about how many apples there are in the bowl. But if you were using personal truth as a whole metaphysic, you wouldn't ever bother telling somebody how your day went, because, well, they could never understand your lived experience. But instead, it's when somebody shares something subtler, something more context-dependent, that these sort of disclaimers about personal truth start coming in, because these types of things are often misunderstood. Yeah, nobody caveats when they're talking about basic physical objects, but they caveat all the time about things like art or religion or which types of things they prefer. So what I think is actually going on is translation difficulties. Like in the Tower of Babel, every person, and even every part of yourself, speaks a slightly different language. Your brain has to translate sounds and pictures into an internal landscape, then translate that landscape into a memory. Your skin cells have to translate external conditions into nerve signals, then that gets translated into meanings, like heaviness or softness. People have to translate each other's words, all using slightly different versions of the memory dictionary. Yeah, and when we try to communicate subtler things than this, there are all kinds of extra things going on. Our worldview, our mind's eye reality, has these endless feedback loops of thought and spirituality and reason and emotion. I could have a feeling about something I saw, then a thought about that emotion, then a sense that that thought was evil, and then an emotion about seeing myself as evil, and it goes on and on. And because this is all internal, it can happen very quickly, and because we don't talk about this stuff all that often, it can also be very imprecise. One thing to notice here is that an artist's job is communicating their internal landscape, and so they often end up seeming easier to relate to because their skills are better developed. So we can recognize their internal landscapes in us and so on. All of this to say, people will tell you their internal subtle things that they believe just in case you agree, but will then say that it's their personal truth to indicate that they don't want to argue with you if you think otherwise. You know, I tend to think that saying you wouldn't understand can be a little bit clearer than saying this is my personal truth, but I also think that this sense of subtlety is spirituality. And so when people say personal truth, they are genuinely expressing a desire for spiritual freedom, instead of just being pressured in towards the same positions as the good debaters. And I do support this type of freedom. However, I also do think that all truths will ultimately be connected together eventually. Maybe in the future, maybe if, a good translation is eventually discovered, and so the gap can be bridged. Yeah, so because these problems with communication are to do with translation, the most primal experiences, when you're totally in the moment, are completely internally consistent and totally true, because you haven't actually tried to understand anything or interpret anything yet. And you also have to see that the fact that we ever bother trying to translate anything at all depends on this primal experience being stable. If the basic nature of reality changes every day, or if people's experiences are just fundamentally different, you have to ask yourself why anybody bothers using words at all. Yeah, so eventually you get these chains of information that get less and less reliable the further they are from the source. But we can cross-reference what we hear with other strings of information. And so if somebody tells me that islands are floating on the ocean, I could cross-reference this with my knowledge that rocks sink, and now I have a method of becoming a little bit more skeptical of the first claim. Yeah, and so once again, we're back to the start, where you sort of cross-reference your chains, and now truth is a network of alignments, as we use it and how we understand it as humans. So I'm moving more towards less connected parts of my thoughts on this. Maths is a special case here for its total lack of subtlety and immense precision of translation because it is entirely built from alignments. The equals sign is two lines which are aligned, and it basically means that an equation is true, and because maths is built entirely out of abstractions to begin with, its definitions are exact definitions, which is why nobody bothers to use local symbols and scripts for maths anymore. Like, a 3 is a 3 is a 3. There aren't any connotations or associations from a culturally embedded script which could actually improve anything. Like, you want exact definitions here, so any extra meanings or additional nuance would make everything you're trying to do harder. And exact definitions make translations exact as well. So it's possible to never miscommunicate. You could send an equation through an infinite series of translations, and the meaning isn't actually going to change at all. Yeah, which is nice. And to bring up my final point, something else vaguely related to all this is that a circular argument is one that goes if A then B, and if B then A. Now, this is internally consistent. We could say internally aligned. But it has a strange property where it's compelling only if you already live within it. If you believe A or B already, the whole argument is completely logical. But if you don't, the whole thing is completely dismissible. The reason why it's so important to find common ground at the start of a debate is that if you don't, you can both get stuck in loops that are internally consistent, but that contradict each other.
That's almost the whole video. I hope got 32 subscribers. I think he added 4 since we had our conversation, something like that, perhaps. So, yeah, Ethan came. 10 months ago, 1 day ago. Thank you, Ethan. So, yeah, check out Check out Sam's channel. There's two other ones to see. You know, an interesting example of this. I just finished the sermon and I was thinking, okay, I'm gonna make a video. So I open up YouTube and front and center is this.
Now I want to get to the reason that I think Epstein probably did survive.
Before you do, does it matter?
Yes and no. I mean, for one thing,
It seems to me that he was a puppeteer, but he wasn't, it seems, a brilliant puppeteer.
well, let's put it this way. If he survived,
Now we've got Doctor here, so you know we're not just going to say Brett and Heather. We've got, she didn't take his last name. I don't know why, but that's sometimes signal of a certain political or cultural valence, hierarchy. But of course, it was so interesting because when Epstein died, I didn't just pay any attention to this thing, and I didn't pay any attention to this thing for the longest time. They just keep throwing things out, and then more things are out there, and it's like I just don't, does it matter? Well, what does that question mean? Does it matter to me? Does it change my life? Now Epstein wound up coming up quite a bit at last Sunday's Estuary. And, really, part of the reason why I love Estuary is I have such good people in our local estuary. And I don't think that's unusual. I think many estuaries have some really remarkable people in them. And I always get new thoughts and new ideas. And, one of the things that one of the people said was, if the elites of the country are seen as getting away with it, that undermines any rule of law in the country. Because basically what it says is that the entire legal justice apparatus is only small people are subjected to it. Now many of us run around with a suspicion like that, but when we see it played out, we have this alignment, we have this correspondence. And again, as I was talking in the Peter Williams, Tom Holland conversation, most of that type of debate is all against sort of this correspondence foundationalism, that we're going to have these first principles. And boy, wouldn't it be wonderful if those were like mathematic, because then you don't have the translation error. Again, I really like how Sam laid a bunch of this stuff out. It was really good. And then the idea is that from first principles, you can just construct a world full of these syllogisms. And in that way, this whole thing is just this giant certainty game. And I belong to a tradition, a theological tradition, that has always been quite presuppositionalist, which means that, okay, where you start from impacts a lot of where you end up, which again, someone born in a Muslim nation, blah, 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 blah. So when it wasn't too long ago that I thought, we're going to have a lot of conspiracy theories about Jeffrey Epstein isn't dead, which reminded me of Elvis isn't dead, Hitler isn't dead, Nero isn't dead, Michael Jackson isn't dead. Why do we have these high status things that happen? And again, these happen perennially. Now, I've seen with human beings, part of the reason that we have the kind of funeral ceremonies we have, like often you have the public presentation of the body. Well, why do we do that? That's important psychologically. Part of this starts to happen during the American Civil War, where they're finally developing the kind of technology whereby soldiers killed on the battlefield can be brought home, basically embalmment, can be brought home so that family members can see and believe that their loved one is dead. That's pretty important. And so basically what Brett does in this video, well, first, why it matters. And they don't get into any of the arguments that my estuary got into.
That describes a landscape of people who participated in dodging justice for him, in hoodwinking the public, in breaking the justice system. So the point is, that's a vast crime of its own, right? We had a right to...
That's a different question from, does it matter if he still lives?
Well,
if he lives, then that implies more crimes yet.
It implies more.
And what's interesting, because it's not, if we're looking at Tom Holland and Peter Williams, or, oh gosh, yeah, let's bring this conversation in. So Hezi is a peacemaker. And part of the reason Hezi is excited about the TLC is because when Sam talks about these translation issues, Hezi is hoping that with enough conversation, translation, there's a degree of oneness that we can achieve, that enmity can be reduced, and we can get somewhere. Now this is tremendously difficult, because on one hand, just the fact that we're having the conversations we are having in the way that we are having them is an achievement. And so I certainly celebrate with Hezi the things that we are. But then, of course, things get difficult.
And then what I'm asking you is, like, do you feel in the TLC there's movement in the Christian world where you could feel like I could qualify them as such, which then, of course, requires work. And this goes back to what you were saying, Jacob, about all the creatures, right? We have to have love for all the creatures of the world, referencing also non-Jews, because, and I think that conversation is happening. Like, when I look at this, my goal is to now, like, they'll all abandon Jesus. My goal is to get to the point where the idea of Jesus, and this could be, I hope this is not offending anyone, as long as the idea of Jesus is sort of in the prism, like it falls inside our prism, but we have the tools to allow ourselves to have a large tent. Then, like, why is that not the conversation we're seeking right now? Even though that's not the ultimate unity, right? Because if, whoever comes at the end of days, who are we to deny that acceptance, right? We have our own beliefs, but if you have the tools to create a large tent, why not seek to do that?
There's still a difference between what's used to the phrase, one who rejects idolatry as a Jew, I think is useful as internal language and talking to other Jews about how to treat non-Jews. I also don't love I'm realizing, like, the translation of creature is not good either. And Briot does it will come off wrong, because Briot doesn't. You're not in English, that has implications of, like, it includes animals, and then you, like,
correct. You're right.
Not just animals, but that's not in the Hebrew.
Creation.
So again, like, but it's really hard. But that's to the point of, it's really hard to come up with language that speaks both internally and externally. And you might need differences. I might acknowledge that there's a difference between internal language and external language. And the group, and when I was speaking to other Jews, using Briot, using that phrase, that line from the Talmud, is great for creating the ability and the potential to have a big tent with 4 other Jews to non-Jews. However, that's not the language that's necessary, probably, for the language that's as useful for the bridge that actually helps talk to non-Jews.
That's a very good point.
And yeah, and this gets into these, because especially, like, languages especially because language can trigger these. I mean, yeah, right, Luke. This is where the creeds and dogmas and the things, you get all these, because language triggers these immune responses.
And I mean, I have to say, I have a much harder time with a Reform synagogue than I do with a Catholic church, for very good reason. And that's, I think, part of the reason Sam gets treated even worse than the Jews a little bit.
The narcissism of small differences, are the thing that's quite like you but just a little bit different, is more annoying or more threatening than the thing that's more different than you. right? Like, why will Gavin Ortland publicly talk to Mormons but not talk to me? It's because it's pretty clear to draw a divide between him and the Mormons, and like that kind of thing. I mean, I think unity always needs to be asked in the question of, like, in what context and for what purpose. Like, do I want to find a way so that I could have communion with Jews? That's like an oxymoron in categorization, because by the time you're taking communion, you're a Christian. But do I want to find a way that I could, well, like, one thing that I really like about TLC that I
and of course, when Sam says communion, it's gotten more complex since we've had Jordan Hall talking about community and communion and society, where communion is this deep intimacy. And on one hand, we've got a degree of intimacy in the TLC. A big part of this project is to get to know one another, to spend time together, to not get these allergic reactions to things, and yet not necessarily tiptoe around things, to get to a point where, but of course, we've got these alignments, and we've got these correspondences, and we've got these coherences.
hope it continues to be able to do is to be a place where we can offend each other well. And Joseph can bring up the Marcionite Gospels, and I'll bring up counterpoints against the Marcionite Gospels if I have to, and we can have that discussion, and maybe I might even learn something from that, or realize that that's like a whole flank of my knowledge or defenses that I hadn't even anticipated before, or something like that. You know, those sorts of things are good, but it takes some amount of community and trust and unity to even be able to do that sort of thing. Do I want to figure out how to live in a country with, you know, Jewish people? Well, that's a much different question. Do I want to figure out how my town can be like 80% Christian by heritage and 20% Jewish by heritage? We still put up a Christmas tree and Christmas lights, but we have a lit up menorah kind of on the side as like a nice little gesture. And so, but we don't have like Jesus anywhere, but it's still a Christmas tree, and everyone knows what the lights are on the fence posts. And like, you know, like how do we balance that such that, you know, it's still kind of Christian, but the Jews don't feel too offended or excluded? You know, those are different questions.
You just said somebody, by the time they're taking communion, they're a Christian, they're not a Jew. Whereas I am in communication with several people who you might not even believe the positions they're in, who are from a Jewish background, and they are, I mean, I can't even say without explaining, but they're like, okay, here I am with Christianity, and if Jesus is my Lord, and he says, I have come to fulfill the law and not to destroy it. And if all the things that Father Stephen says about the continuity of Christianity with Judaism, and it, you know, especially the Catholics, there's a whole society of Jewish Catholics who are trying to understand, like Gideon Lazar, him I can publicly name, right? Here he is. He's a Catholic, and because he's a Catholic, now he's suddenly learning about Judaism because, like, Nostra Aetate says, oh no, God didn't just get rid of the Jews theologically, right? And so, like, you said that, I'm sure not meaning to offend anyone, but I can think of,
well, I think I can be allowed to offend people. That was one of my points.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and you are certainly allowed to offend people. And frankly, I think to some extent I have to agree with you. Look,
which was one of the points that Jordan Peterson made to Kathy Newman. It's like, you've been offending me. Don't I get a chance to offend you? As long as we do it within a certain spirit together.
By the time you are, you know, considering holy orders in the Catholic or a similar church, then maybe you should probably recognize, yeah, that's not what Christianity's been for 2,000 years.
I mean, but I mean, hence it's so interesting, because when did Christians and Jews have the opportunity to explore together what a relationship to God is?
So a couple of things. I mean, Brent is bringing up Al-Andalus, and yes, there was a lot like and within I don't know Brent's background, but like Al-Andalus was brought up all the time in Jewish kind of interfaith dialogue, constantly. And like for 200 years, we've over-romanticized, especially the German Jews, over-romanticized Al-Andalus as like this, whatever, paradise. And everything we should revive, everything, Hebrew grammar, Bible studies, like everything should go back to Al-Andalus. We need Jewish poets again, right? Like so much of early Zionism and Jewish cultural civilizational arguments are made because of that vision of this
a second.
Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together and exchanging ideas and whatever.
A second about it. When we congregated in Israel, we had to reconcile the three accents of Hebrew: the Ashkenazi, the Sephardi, and the Yemenite. And the Ashkenazi, as racist as they are, accepted unconditionally the Sephardi pronunciation. And everybody recognized that the Yemenite tradition is the most authentic. This is one of the miracles of the creation of Israel.
But they didn't use the Yemenite, even though it was the most authentic. They chose to go. I mean, in part, this is because Ben Yehuda was influenced by the Algerians and Tunisians more than others. But like, oh, you can't hear me?
No,
I can hear you.
Okay, I mean, Yoav was pointing to his thing.
Are you talking about how the Hebrew language was reconstructed in the?
Yeah, he's talking about the modern Hebrew pronunciation was chosen for the modern state, or before the modern state, even in 1890s, 1900.
When I was younger, there was a guy in our synagogue that moved from America, so he had a very, very heavy American accent, like in Hebrew. But his tradition, even though he was European, like Ashkenazi, his tradition though was to read with the Yemenite cantillation and cadence, and it was horrible. Here in synagogue, it was just like, I feel like really at some point God was like, all right, dude, I get it. Like, thanks, but it was intense. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Go on, Yosef. So that was the dream.
I wanted to take your question, Chazi, and ask it to Sam. And I don't know if I think he was here for your whole question, but Chazi was basically asking me, when I'm here and I'm interacting, am I thinking that I am laying the groundwork for some bigger tent beyond just like some basic, like, how do I have you as a neighbor and not like whatever, but like actually a bigger tent of like deeper relationships across, Jews and non-Jews and whatever, and denominations, whatever. And I said, like, I think yes, generally, but some of my stuff, especially the historical stuff, like bringing up the Marcionite stuff, is dangerous to them because like it really does threaten core identity for like Christians, and understandably so. Like I get that. I get why that would be done. So I'm going to ask you the same question. Like you are here, and maybe in a similar boat where like you are trying to create you're not trying to get more Unitarians, as you've in your like channel your review, right? I know that. Okay, maybe you're mostly not. You're mostly not trying to get more Unitarians. You're mostly trying to get other Christians to accept Unitarians as like part of the Christian vision, brotherhood, whatever, body. And yet, I have a feeling that when you bring up a lot of the historical stuff and you do push buttons. So like, how do you view your work? Like, because stuff kind of undermine it.
Yeah, I mean, so my points are just as destructive to certain kinds of Christianity as a Marcionite gospel argument, right? Like let's say my historical points are correct and that all Christians prior to 350 AD were Unitarians or modalists of some variety, and there was no such a thing as a Trinitarian, and that it developed later, and that the earlier you go, the more everyone looks like me, the later you go, the less everyone looks like me. Therefore, I'm original Christianity, you're not. If Jesus didn't think he was God, then it's very strange to think that he is God. That's just an irreconcilable contradiction, no matter what model of historical development you cling to, right? Okay, that is at least as destructive of a point as the Marcionite Gospels, right? Like, because that would mean Catholicism is bunk, Orthodoxy is bunk, and the vast majority of Protestantism is either bunk or needs to seriously rethink itself, right? And various Protestant denominations could rethink themselves. Various other ones are just as tied up in the knot of Trinitarian credibility as Catholicism and Orthodoxy, right? So I just threw like nearly 2 billion people under that bus. And so, you know, that's a pretty, you know, heavy thing to claim. And I get that. And I think that that's, you know, I suppose my vision is I know that some Catholic scholars especially can do the weird sort of thing where they have their history brain and their faith brain, and they don't really mix, right? They can do historical scholarship and say things very similar to what I say, and then they like turn it off when they're in church and they've got like faith brain on. I consider that to be slightly too unintegrated of an approach to these sorts of questions, but I don't mind such an approach because they can normally be somewhat kind to me. But basically what I'm asking of Protestantism is at the very least, we need to consider what I'm saying an open question, because my goal is not just to be treated nicely, my goal is actual communion among Unitarian and Trinitarian Protestants, and probably mostly you could even say evangelicals, of however you want to define that, biblically oriented evangelicals.
And of course, he would have to tell us what communion looks like. And he would probably say that, well, we can go to the same church, but then can we say the same creed? And pretty soon they're going to talk about the resurrection. And then all of this was to try to illustrate some of the point that's happening with these two with respect to, well, does it matter if he's alive? And it's an interesting question because, well, he was alive for however long he was alive for, and it didn't matter much to me. I never knew his name. I didn't know what he was doing. But once, of course, the news gets out, and he falls within this matrix of definitions. So here's a man, and he's got these relationships, and he's doing these things, and people in power know it. And they even know that he's doing horrible things, but they cook up this sort of sweetheart deal so that he can be, you know, he can not go to jail for the horrible things that he's done to, you know, how many young women, and all of these powerful people are involved. And of course, Brett, and it was just so interesting to me that this is Brett Weinstein, because I've listened to him talk about metaphorical truth, and all of those arguments. And basically in this video he makes the argument that, well, here's an argument for Jeffrey Epstein that he's alive. And again, it's not really hard to come up with that argument. But what does the argument mean? And this is dissimilar to these theological conversation that they're having on Jacob's channel, because again, going back to Sam's alignments, well, if Jeffrey Epstein can do untold horrible things, why can't I? Now suddenly you're going to have all kinds of questions about justice and whether or not justice is served equally among the citizens of a nation. Because the idea is that if he does this, he should go to jail. So if anybody, and the reason he goes to jail is because if anybody does these things, they should go to jail. And that threatens that whole system. So they don't really get into that here.
Crimes yet. But it also, I think, is suggestive of where we should be looking for this power to be continued to be wielded. So to the extent that the thing is still lost.
And that's important because then the question is, okay, how will this roll into the future? Because obviously there's a system going on and it continues to unfold.
Epstein having survived is meaningful because, wow, is it an important feature of the Game of Thrones that's being conducted. So I think that the game theory, quite apart from the evidence, and there is evidence that's weird. There's evidence that there was a decoy.
And we don't have to go through this whole thing because it's, but again, it's just, and again, part of what's interesting about this is that this is Brett making this argument. And the personal connection is always there because, of course, Brett has been on his own journey. He was someone who was within institutions, within a confessional system, and now his confessionality with respect to biology, he continues to maintain, but now he's got these other views that are, let's say, outside the system, because the systems themselves are part of these truth networks. Then, of course, his brother's on trigonometry.
Before November of 1952, with the test known as Ivy Mike, the first hydrogen bomb, you know, there's like before Christ and after Christ, and they're just very different. Suddenly, we were like gods. And that is the BC AD of human history. It's much more important than the birth.
And of course, the plural, the we, is always so slippery because we were like gods, or certain individuals on top of certain human hierarchies are like gods.
The Christ.
What is the difference between the nuclear weapon as it originally was and the second generation, the hydrogen bomb, etc.?
Well, there was no point to duck and cover.
Well, and then he's going to go into a bunch of this stuff. But there's one moment in here that was just so interesting. When I listen to him talk this way, it's amazing.
On one planetary surface, we're not all doomed. And that doesn't seem to animate anyone. To me, it's clearly the world's most important question. I've spent my entire life on this question. I'm not really on the podcast circuit. That's what I really do. And no one's interested. Like no government is interested. There's no institute, there's no fund, there's nothing you can apply for. No one is interested in the idea that the solar system is an escape room and that Einstein is our jailer. We've got to get past Einstein before the thing goes off. It's as clear as day to me.
And of course, he'll get into it and he'll say, well, we all share this atmosphere. So it just reminds me of C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man. Humanity must be preserved, because that's, of course, his foundation. And it's really funny listening to him say it, because I've got these old videos of Brett saying that, where, you know, basically we're just these assassin robots programmed by our DNA. And so this is what we must preserve. And you know, he's like, nobody's trying to get us out of this thing. Nobody's trying to get us, the solar system is an escape room. And then when you look at, okay, well, you look at how hard it is to try to send anything to Mars. The difficulty of leaving the solar system just completely dwarfs any effort to get to Mars. I mean, just completely dwarfs it. And that's this part. Well, we're not even starting. We're not even doing it. And of course, there's always this subtext beneath it that he's got this equation he can put in a coffee cup that if people would really pay attention to it, then we could achieve this. I have to find this one moment because it's a tiny little thing he says.
Let me put it on the table. I don't think anybody's thinking rationally.
Why do you say that?
Because I think I'm thinking rationally. I think
the only one in the world who's thinking rationally. Okay, but that's not the point I want to hit. All right, instead of me just hunting it, we'll just play it.
No one can handle it because nobody actually is motivated to go beyond. If general relativity holds, gentlemen, we're in real trouble. It's very hard. Einstein is the problem.
So this is what's really fun. So we had this theological conversation over here, and they were going to get to the resurrection and debating, could the Jews acknowledge resurrection? And they're like, well, we get these stories of resurrection, but very quickly in the Christian conversation, it's kind of come up that, yeah, we've got Lazarus coming back from the dead, but he will die again. We've got Jesus raising the son of the widow of Nain, but he dies again. When Christians talk about resurrection and then ascension, because actually it's those two things together that really make sort of a departing point, because then basically the resurrection and ascension mean God's vindication of Jesus, because no one raised Jesus from the dead besides the Father. And you also have the fact that according to the story, Jesus is Lord. He reigns on high. He governs the universe. And well, that's all esoteric stuff. And okay, then we have, is Jeffrey Weinstein still alive or not? And I was like, well, does that really matter? And now we have, if Einstein is correct, we're all doomed. Oh, so before we had to make decisions about whether or not, and it's much more relevant, whether or not I can live again, because the same resurrection that Jesus passes through, I will pass through. That's what Christianity says. And that then gets into, I've really got to study more of Sam's, because Jesus isn't God. Okay, but that then, and this is a conversation I've had with Sam, then what is he? Is he a third thing? And if he's a third thing, and if he's not fully human, because then you have the adoptionist, you have all of this stuff, and we're working through all of these things. And so one of the arguments I made to him is that just in terms of scalability, even though people struggle with saying how the Trinity works, the doctrine itself is a fairly simple one. Is Jesus God? Yes. Is Jesus human? Yes. And Jesus being God means that he can save us. Jesus being human means that we follow his path through resurrection into the age to come. It's very simple. And when Jesus starts to not quite be God and not quite be man, but be sort of a third thing, well, then suddenly, well, maybe he'll have the power to save us. But often in early church questions were, is Jesus truly human? Because that's, today, people don't have a problem with the humanity of Jesus. People have the problem with the divinity of Jesus. They have problems with divinity in general. But very early on, people had a lot of questions about humanity of Jesus, because then the question was, because there's the report of him doing all these miraculous things, he's being worshipped, he's divinized. So then was Jesus did he only look human? Was he, when Jesus eats a fish, was he a ghost? Was he resurrected? All of this stuff. But now we've got Newtonian mechanics, is that we're going to have to, and is Eric saying that it's not true? Is that what we're talking about?
What do you mean by that, Eric?
We're 4 light years away from the nearest star. So if you think about habitable planetary surfaces, if you could grant science fiction powers to Elon and he could terraform the moon and Mars, we'd have 3 spheres.
So in other words, he's basically saying Elon's not going to be able to do that. Oh, so what's harder, getting to the stars or terraforming Mars and the moon? Which is harder? How on earth should I know? But to me, the distances to the stars seem harder than trying to do something about what I think he's about to say now.
You could get to sort of by chemical rockets. That is not enough diversification for humanity. It's nowhere close. So then you have this issue. Okay, where do we get the supply of spheres? The issue is atmospheres. We're all connected by the same atmosphere. So you saw that with like Chernobyl. The cloud doesn't stay in Ukraine. The only place to find new planetary surfaces, if we're not going to make artificial platforms, which is very difficult.
And that was it right there. Artificial platforms, that's very difficult. So because that's very difficult, instead, we're going to build starships and inhabit other planets, and we're going to do this on a time frame before we blow ourselves up. I'm not sure these artificial platforms are harder than the solution you're offering. I mean, and he's a smart guy, and he says this stuff, and I just think, but is it true? One of the things I loved about what Dawn had to say was part of the epistemic, the end of the modernist epistemic crisis is it's more information. If you're sort of within a bubble, if you're within an atmosphere, you can sort of believe what everyone else has. But now suddenly when we have different groups that are competing, it gets harder. And that's Joseph was challenging me upon whether we're painting, whether there's religion in the bricks that we're painting over, or we're painting religion over the bricks. That's actually a really hard question, because I've worked the metaphor, if you watch my videos carefully, I've worked the metaphor both ways. And there are a lot of things connected to whichever way you work that metaphor. Now, a number of you have asked me to talk about this conversation. I haven't yet. It was a really lovely conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Regular columnist for the New York Times, Ron and Pollitt, quite a bit to talk about. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Those are very flattering introduction. We'll see if I can live up to it.
Let's see. We'll test you for the next hour. No, I have every confidence. Let me start with this. When I was a doctoral student in Paris many years ago, François Mitterrand was the president of France, right? The famous socialist, left-leaning guy. He was asked one time about his religious faith, and I presume he was, born and raised a Catholic. He said, well, the ethics of Christianity are great. But then he said, but la métaphysique, no one takes the metaphysics seriously. The dogmas, no one believes. And I thought of him when I read the beginning of your book, where there's the atheists, both old and new, that just say it's a bunch of nonsense. But then there's this kind of mediating position. Well, no one believes the substance of it, but it's a good framework to hang our ethics on, or informs our morals.
Right.
And you're unhappy with that. You're not satisfied with that. What I think really is a patronizing view toward religion. You do worry about la métaphysique. You do worry about the truth claim of religion.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth worrying about, right? It seems like, since it does touch on the most fundamental questions about, life and death and who we are. I think what you have in our culture now, though, is something that goes a little bit beyond the Mitterrand shrug, right?
Yeah.
Where you have a number of people who sort of take the Mitterrand view, but go one step further and say, well, it would be nice if
it were true.
If la métaphysique, c'est vrai, right? It would be nice, but could one really believe that?
Yeah.
And I think there are more of those people maybe in the 2020s than there were in the 2000s and 2010s. I think we've lived through a period of time where secularism has advanced, where sort of, the famous new atheists had a moment in the sun. And people, especially in the United States, but also in Western Europe, I think feel very dissatisfied with where that's taken us. And so then the question becomes, for people who do believe in the metaphysique, right? We can keep lapsing into French throughout this conversation.
Feel free.
Is whether you can take those people one step further, right? Whether you can take the opportunity and say, well, not only would it be nice if it were true, but there is in fact a pretty good argument that it is true after all.
Yeah. Are you surprised the new atheists faded as quickly as they have? I remember, they were all the rage in the early zeros, like right after September 11th, which is not an accident, it seems to me, that September 11th revived the old Enlightenment view that religion is irrational, therefore violent. And I remember talking to a young physician here at the Mayo Clinic, and he was a high school student in Ireland, right when all this was all the rage. And he said, Dawkins and Hitchens, they swept through our high school, Catholic high school classrooms. We all believe them. But now they've really faded. Are you surprised by that, how quickly it went?
I mean, I think the new atheists deserve a lot of credit for making some pretty concrete predictions about the world. Like, you know, I'm in the punditry business, and there's always a temptation to sort of hedge and be vague and say, you know, on the one hand, on the other hand. Yeah. And Hitchens, Dawkins, you know, they just came out and straightforwardly said, you know, the less religion, the better the world will be, right? Get rid of the Bronze Age superstitions and the sky god and the flying spaghetti monster, and the world will become more enlightened and rational and scientific and so on. And if you're looking for a story about their fade, I think you just have to say that 10 or 15 years of a further retreat from religion has yielded basically the opposite of what they predicted. Nobody looks around at U.S. politics today and says, as we got less religious, we became less polarized, more trusting of medical and scientific authority. So in that sense, I think that they were victims of their own willingness to sort of push their chips in, right? And say, you know, leave God behind and the world will become a better place. Because then if you get the world we live in, people will naturally look around and say, well, even if there's no God, that style, that claim, that promise didn't work out terribly well.
Right.
And not, I mean, to be fair, there's still plenty of people who, I mean, I have had these debates, you've had these debates, who hold effectively new atheist perspectives on the world. It just doesn't have the cultural currency that it did in that kind of post 9/11 moment.
Yeah. A couple of things that kind of intrigued me still about the new atheists. One is, I mean, how poorly informed they were about sophisticated approaches to religion. So dealing with straw men all the time, and they betrayed very little sense of what serious theists believe about God. That there's a philosophically, you know, coherent account of God that rarely figured in. But the second thing that still surprises and kind of infuriates me, how bad we were, I mean, religious people, at dealing with them. The great exception is William Lane Craig, you know, the Protestant philosopher, who was using a lot of the Catholic intellectual tradition. But when I'd watch those debates between like Hitchens and somebody else, or Dawkins, the pathetic performance of the religious people. And this, you know, confirms my view that we had dumbed down the faith for so long that we lost our own ability to defend ourselves against relatively superficial metaphysical position.
And what he says there is interesting, because we dumb down our faith. What does he mean by that? Well, you've heard him talk in other things where basically says, well, we brought in the guitars, and I don't know if the change of music was dumbing it down. He basically is saying we failed to educate our groups sufficiently to hold back these arguments. And I don't know, because there are plenty of debates where you would have Bishop Barron, who is a very sophisticated metaphysician. And I remember reading this book on transubstantiation and lots of footnotes to Robert Barron. And, you know, he's a very well-educated man. And that book was really helpful in sort of helping me understand why, you know, a real presence, you know, Christ is present spiritually. That's what the Heidelberg Catechism says. Well, what does that mean? And, you know, the deeper you get into this other tradition, but even if you yourself can sort of study this tradition and find it compelling, you're still going to have a scalability issue, which probably isn't what we think it is, because the truth is that sort of the herd immunity of believability, the plausibility structure, if you remember Tony Campolo's little speech to his son, is maintained by the cohesion of the group that's there.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like you couldn't, you know, turn on public television for a while without seeing Dawkins or Hitchens having their way with some, I would say hapless, well-meaning bishop, but that would be the right. But yeah, but I think part of it was that there was a kind of cultural equilibrium before that moment. It was a little bit like the Mitterrand line, right, where people who had ceased to believe or practice the faith or practice a faith would say things like the French president, that, you know, religion is good as far as it goes, but I don't believe in the miracles or the dogma. And religious people had gotten used to arguing in that landscape. And so to have people come along and say, no, it's all rotten. God is not great, how religion poisons everything.
Right.
To sort of take the fight more seriously in the old 18th century Enlightenment.
And there's a real difference between saying that religion is wrong and evil and saying that religion doesn't work. And with many people, I think it often sort of begins in that, well, it doesn't work. Well, what is it supposed to do? Well, when I go to church and my mother is sick and I ask the pastor or the priest to pray, my mother should get better. And so then it doesn't work. And they usually sort of began with it doesn't work and then moved on to it's evil. And then, of course, you had plenty of people with their church hurt that would say, yeah, it is evil. I'm better without it. And now we're sort of coming around to the other side of like, well, it actually was doing things I didn't appreciate. And now I sort of want it back.
And écraser l'enfant, Voltairean style. Yes, I think absolutely. Religious leaders and sort of believers weren't prepared for that. I think the internet also played a role here, that you had a kind of, you mentioned, the new atheists going through a Catholic high school or something like a whirlwind. If you were doing religious education or running a church youth group or these kind of things before the internet, I think you got kind of used to having a quasi-captive audience, right? You've got these kids and you're the religious authority, and obviously they have other authorities, but the other temptations are sort of moral temptations, drinking and sex and drugs and so on. The idea of these teenagers suddenly being able to go on the internet and be exposed to someone in a charming British accent explaining why, their youth pastor is full of it. I think that was something that the churches had no inoculation
against. How pathetic that was, that even our youth pastors or high school teachers weren't able to make a fundamental case along the line.
As if high school students are very persuaded by fundamental cases, because a lot of what those youth pastors had to face was the fact that there was a culture that said basically if someone on a screen is an authority, they're a being of light. So then you've got sort of this deep symbolic psychological effect that light is shining through the person. And they speak with authority, and so they should be believed compared to their high school teacher that, says awkward things or doesn't dress pretty well or doesn't. I mean, it's so interesting how Bishop Barron says, well, they should have been able to defeat them in terms of arguments. Are you talking sort of like creating this scale of syllogisms again? Or are you talking persuasion? Because anybody will tell you that it's for many people, one would probably easily say most people, persuasion and this tower of syllogisms live in two separate universes.
Lines of a C.S. Lewis, or along the lines that, you're proposing in your book too, that we couldn't engage in that kind of fundamental apologetics. That is a tragedy. I lived through that time. I lived through dumbed down Catholicism. And I think the New Atheist period proved in a way what a disaster that was. Pastorally speaking, not just intellectually, but pastorally. We lost a lot of young people because of our inability to engage their minds. When you read the accounts of why people left,
I'm not sure that's why we lost people.
I'm always struck by, we didn't get our questions answered.
Yeah.
Science refutes religion. Religion is stupid. Bronze Age. They'll use all the Hitchens language. That's a failure on our part too, on the part of religious leadership.
Yeah, and I think you had patterns of sort of treating people with questions as problems, right? It's like, and again, these are stereotypes and you don't want to lean too much into the stereotypes, but the idea of the troublesome kid in religious education who asks too many questions and so on, it's a cliche, right? Yeah. For a reason, because it does exist. And yeah, being ready with actual responses to that when you suddenly have a multiplication of the number of people with those questions is something that you absolutely needed and didn't have. I'm
quite skeptical that if you had armed, Peter Kreeft has a wonderful book. It's an outline of apologetics, and it's a good book, and it's full of good arguments. Of course, Peter Kreeft grew up Reformed Church in America, went to Calvin College, broke the Calvin College philosophy department's heart by joining the Catholic Church. And Peter Kreeft is a philosopher, and he's written lots of books about apologetics and things like that. And it really, I got that book fairly early after coming back to North America, because I found the book just tremendously helpful, because here are the arguments, and Peter Kreeft just in short form just kind of goes through it. And I don't know that just handing that book out to all the high school teachers and youth group counselors would have stemmed the tide. I think that's a deficient view of just basically how people work. Now, some of the other things that Bishop Barron is pointing out might have been, in fact, more salient, but I'm not sure of that, too, because just go ahead and listen to the conversation between Cale and his mom about what the Catholic Church did. Now, an entire plausibility structure and was sort of being taken apart, and this wave goes through not only the Catholic Church, but the entire nation, but then other waves came through, just sort of like the Jesus movement. When you look at the Jesus movement, which brought in many of those people that have sort of been swept out of the 1950s, 1960s religion, there were new plausibility structures that they found compelling, and their alignments, as Sam sort of, it was pleasing. This alignment is pleasing, and for many of them, it was very biblicistic, and even Catholics. I mean, it was the charismatic Catholics. I mean, they started studying the Bible as lay persons. How Protestant of them, but they found the alignments very pleasing. All right, so here's the Peter Williams, Tom Holland, and here's our boy Nathan, and here's Foley. I think that's his name, and look at the hair here. I think that's Glenn Scrivener, and one of the shots of the crowd, Alex O'Connor's out there. So this is a big deal that happened, and unsurprising to most of us, Nathan didn't find too much of it compelling, and he usually doesn't. And Foley, I just found this conversation between Scrivener and Foley, which is something I want to see. And then in the chat during the live stream today, Nathan was talking about, because you always you gain status by being able to brag to your other apes that you are hanging out with higher status apes. And in the comments, he was talking about AOC, not the assemblywoman from the state of New York, but the young man who was the cosmic skeptic. Was that his name? He was the cosmic skeptic, and then went to Oxford, and I tend to watch a fair amount of Alex O'Connor, and I really enjoy watching him, and I think I'm very impressed with how he's. I think he's a good faith. I think he's trying in good faith to be honest. And then Nathan says this. He also complained about many of the YouTubers he met and the emptiness of their lives, and hinted that he wanted to be able to encourage something real and more positive. Truth. And, I talked in the live stream about, part of what happened with this mass wave that comes through. I mean, the Protestants sort of shrink it down to the Bible. And then the Enlightenment says basically rationality or empiricism. That's what we're going to construct this on. And modernity tries to construct all of this on rationality and empiricism and that which can be checked and all of those things. And that's sort of passing away because we recognize that there are presuppositions and we live within these communities about truth. And so Dawn was in a, basic sort of the pared down, but she wanted a fuller, richer world. And I think that's what a lot of orthodoxy and the sacramental the sacramentalist postures want to sort of bring the world out larger. I remember one of my early conversations with Richard Rowland. It was like, once he had read a bunch of Narnia and he had read Tolkien, and then he's reading other ancient myths, and he's like, I want to live in those myths. And truth be told, if everyone around me a nihilist, then I can sure as shoot and believe whatever the heck I want about the world. If you're bringing the world down into, some tiny little truth nugget that it doesn't even matter if humanity is to be preserved. I can believe what I want. So why don't I inhabit a rich world full of angels and demons and saints and sinners, and a world that isn't sort of a plain bare church, but one that is full of images, and one that is full of, and if I'm only going to live a short amount of time in this world, let's live it. And then if I'm wrong, I'm dead. But it's sort of the opposite of Pascal's wager. And I think a lot of people didn't see that coming, because they thought, well, then we're going to live rationally, and we're going to what? Improve the economy, make everyone richer, make sure that everybody has a nice high-speed internet access and a subscription to Netflix, and access to pot and other drugs that can give them other things that they want to see. And someone like Jordan Hall, who, was at the top of the hierarchy early on with video compression, goes all over the world looking for a great community to live in, and finds one in North Carolina because they are wholesome. And when I read this little definition, it's what Alex O'Connor is looking for. He's looking for something wholesome. The emptiness. These YouTubers that are on YouTube fighting about things, but their lives are empty. He's looking for truth that is compelling. And I like this little illustration because in some ways, maybe the hard lines are all this rationality that a really smart person usually imagines they have, because in my experience, if you really start poking at it, well, yeah, there's plenty of fudging going on. The truth is probably a little bit more like those gray lines. But we want something wholesome, something believable, something that I can inhabit. I can understand being wrong, because I'm wrong all the time about all kinds of things. It doesn't bother me so much. But what I really want to know is there hope? Will people be trustworthy? Will they be my friend? And I think for that reason, we rate all these TLC people. They'll believe anything. Probably. Why are we together? Are we sorting everything out? What kind of communion? What kind of communion do we really want? What kind of communion is Hezi really longing for? And I think many of us are in his shoes, because it's like, hey, it's a lot more fun being friends with the Israelis. And maybe even have some Muslims that'll come in and be our friends too. And being friends with a Unitarian, and being friends with a Universalist. And yeah, we're gonna debate some of these things, that instead of just like leaving it up into the university to debate these things. And maybe we won't be as well read as they will, and maybe we won't have as many hot arguments as they do. But you know what? We're gonna get to play, and we're gonna have fun with this. And it's going to be cool. And the cool thing is that you can do it in real life, in estuary, or you can maybe, if you don't have an estuary nearby, or your found hours, or maybe when the wife has taken a trip or is at work late, and you have a couple extra hours, and you can turn it on and you can start a live stream, or just go into the internet, and Jacob is out there in the slow time of the year for his business, and he's just chatting, and he'll talk about anything with you. He really will. And with Jacob, you're going to get an opinion. You surely are. And it's fun. And it's fun seeking truth and comparing notes and doing this. And yeah, I'll get a bunch of things wrong. But at least I'm not alone. At least we're together. And at least we're finding out interesting things about other interesting people in the world. And a lot of good people. And a lot of wholesome people. People that aren't just going to, it wouldn't be fun if we didn't have a few trolls. But the thing about trolls is you don't feel too bad kicking back because they give at least as good as they get. Well, I've been here a while doing this longer than I expected, so another messy video. Let me know what you think.